Imagine a world where two mighty empires clash in a war that lasts over 2 decades, reshaping the Mediterranean forever. From the ashes of Troy rises Aeneas, whose descendants found Rome, but not without cursing Carthage through the tragic love of Dido. This isn't just myth, it's the spark of the First Punic War. A brutal conflict of land and sea battles, innovative weapons like the Corvus, devastating invasions, and staggering losses. Rome, a young republic, challenges the naval superpower Carthage for control of Sicily. Elephants trample legions, fleets sink in storms, and generals like Hamilcar Barca emerge as legends. In this video, we'll dive deep into the origins, key, battles, and aftermath of this epic rivalry. Stay tuned for a journey through history that set the stage for Hannibal's revenge. Subscribe and hit the bell. Let's uncover the secrets of ancient warfare. Virgil's curse, the mythical origins of hatred. Long before Rome and Carthage clashed with steel and fire, poets claimed the rivalry was written in the stars, or rather, in the verses of Virgil's Aeneid, the myth of Aeneas and Dido. In this Roman epic, Aeneas, a Trojan hero and forefather of Rome, finds refuge in Carthage after fleeing the burning ruins of Troy. There he is welcomed by Queen Dido, a powerful and ambitious ruler who founded her city on the North African coast. What begins as an alliance quickly grows into passion. Dido and Aeneas become lovers, and for a moment, it seems that Rome and Carthage might be bound by marriage, not bloodshed. But the gods have other plans. Jupiter reminds Aeneas of his destiny to found a city that would one day become Rome. He abandons Dido, sailing away toward Italy. In her fury and despair, Dido curses Aeneas and his descendants. No love between our peoples, eternal war, eternal hatred. From my ashes shall rise an avenger who will hound the sons of Rome. For the Romans, this myth gave their centuries-long rivalry with Carthage a divine origin. It was not just about territory or trade, it was fate. From myth to reality. Of course, the true conflict had less to do with curses and more to do with power. By the 3rd century BC, Rome had conquered much of Italy. Carthage, meanwhile, had built a maritime empire stretching from North Africa to Spain, Sardinia, and Sicily. Rome was a land power, famous for its disciplined legions. Carthage was a naval superpower, its fleets unrivaled in the Western Mediterranean. Both cities were expanding, both needed new resources, and both had their eyes on Sicily. Here myth faded into history, and it was in Sicily that Dido's curse seemed to come alive. The spark in Sicily. The island of Sicily was the jewel of the central Mediterranean. Fertile fields, strategic harbors, and its position at the crossroads of trade made it irresistible. But it was also divided. Greek colonies held parts of the east, native Sicilians occupied the interior, and Carthage controlled the west. When a band of mercenaries known as the Mamertines seized the city of Messana, they set off a chain reaction that pulled both Rome and Carthage into direct confrontation. This was the spark that would ignite the First Punic War, the longest and most brutal war the ancient world had ever seen up to that point. The Mamertine crisis, Rome's first step into Sicily. The mercenaries of Messana. The city of Messana, modern Messina, sat on the narrow strait separating Sicily from Italy. Whoever controlled Messana controlled the gateway between the Tyrrhenian and Ionian seas. In the early 3rd century BC, a band of mercenaries from Campania, the Mamertine, or Sons of Mars, seized the city. They killed the men, enslaved the women, and carved out their own brutal mini-kingdom. For years, they plundered the countryside, raiding Sicilian towns and clashing with Greek powers like Syracuse. But when Syracuse's king Hero the Setu defeated them in battle, the Mamertines panicked. To survive, they needed a powerful ally. And so, in a desperate gamble, they appealed not to one power, but to two. An appeal to Carthage and Rome. First, they turned to Carthage. The Carthaginians, eager to strengthen their foothold in Sicily, sent a garrison to occupy Messana's citadel. For a moment, it seemed Carthage had gained a new stronghold without firing a shot. But the Mamertines were fickle. Realizing they had traded one master for another, they looked across the strait to Rome. If the Romans would intervene, Messana could play Carthage and Rome against one another. Rome's dilemma. The Roman Senate was torn. On one hand, the Mamertines were pirates and brigands, hardly worthy allies. Supporting them meant betraying Rome's claim to justice and order. On the other hand, if Carthage held Messana, Sicily might fall entirely under their influence. Rome had never fought outside Italy. The decision before them was monumental. Would Rome remain a regional power, or would it take its first step into overseas empire? After fierce debate, the Senate agreed. Rome would send help. For the first time, Roman legions would cross the sea. The first clash. In 264 BC, a Roman army marched into Messana. Confronted by Carthage and Syracuse, the Mamertines handed control of the city to their new Roman protectors. What followed was the opening act of the First Punic War. Rome defeated both Syracuse and Carthage near Messana, securing a foothold on the island. Hero of Syracuse, recognizing Rome's rising power, abandoned Carthage and allied himself with Rome. This alliance would prove decisive. Syracuse became a valuable supplier of food and ships, allowing Rome to sustain a long campaign. The road to total war. What began as a local skirmish over Messana quickly escalated. Rome and Carthage were now locked in a contest for Sicily itself. Neither side could afford to retreat. For the Romans, Sicily was too close to ignore. For Carthage, it was the jewel of their Western empire. And so, what started as a mercenary squabble in a single city would spiral into a 23-year war, fought across seas and continents. The Siege of Agrigentum. Rome learns to wage war overseas. I'd won the prize of Sicily with Messana secured. Rome turned its eyes to the heart of Carthaginian Sicily. At the center of it all stood Agrigentum, Akragas, a wealthy city on the southern coast. Founded by the Greeks, now ruled by Carthage, it was a fortress and supply hub. Whoever held Agrigentum would dominate the island. In 262 BC, Rome marched south with an army of 40,000 men, the largest force they had ever sent overseas. Carthage, unwilling to yield, fortified the city and prepared for a long defense. Rome's first great siege. The Romans were new to overseas war, but not to sieges. They surrounded Agrigentum, cutting off food and water. Siege towers and battering rams were built. The legions dug trenches and blockades, determined to starve the defenders into surrender. Inside, the Carthaginian garrison, supported by thousands of mercenaries, held out, hoping for relief. The relief army. Carthage was not about to lose Agrigentum without a fight. They dispatched a relief army of 50,000 men under Hanno the Great, along with war elephants and cavalry. This force camped near the city, blocking Roman supply lines and threatening to trap the legions. For weeks, the two armies faced each other in a deadly stalemate. The Romans began to starve. Morale sank. For a moment, it seemed their first overseas expedition might end in humiliation. The decisive battle. Finally, desperation forced the Romans into action. The consuls led their troops in a pitched battle outside the city walls. It was brutal. Elephants charged, cavalry clashed, and infantry locked shields in grinding combat. But Roman discipline held. After hours of bloodshed, Hanno's army broke and fled, leaving Agrigentum isolated. Inside the city, famine had reduced the defenders to desperation. Carthage's garrison abandoned Agrigentum under cover of night, slipping away before the Romans stormed the gates. The first Roman victory abroad. Rome had captured its first great prize in Sicily. The victory at Agrigentum stunned the Mediterranean world. A city long thought impregnable had fallen to an army that, just a few years earlier, had never left the Italian mainland. But the cost was staggering. Tens of thousands dead, fields burned, and both sides realizing this would not be a quick war. The war expands. With Agrigentum lost, Carthage could no longer fight the war through scattered strongholds. The conflict had escalated beyond Sicily's borders. Carthage would lean on its greatest strength, its navy. Rome, if it wanted to win, would need to challenge Carthage at sea. And so began the next phase of the war, a struggle for naval supremacy that would redefine Rome forever. Masters of the sea? Rome builds a navy. Rome's weakness. After Agrigentum, the war could not be won on land alone. Carthage's empire was built on the sea. Its fleets controlled trade routes, resupplied armies, and blockaded enemies. Rome, by contrast, had almost no navy. For centuries, their wars had been fought on foot, with legions marching across Italy. At sea, they were amateurs. But now, facing an enemy whose strength floated on the waves, Rome had no choice. If they were to survive, let alone win, they would have to master the sea. A captured ship legend tells us that the Romans got their blueprint from fortune itself. A Carthaginian warship had run aground on the Italian coast. The Romans seized it, studied it, and used it as a model. Within a matter of months, they built an entire fleet, over 120 quinqueremes, massive war galleys with 5 banks of oars. For a land power with little naval tradition, this was an astonishing feat of engineering and determination. But ships alone would not win battles. The Romans needed a way to neutralize Carthage's superior seamanship. The invention of the Corvus. Rome's answer was the Corvus, a terrifying new weapon of naval warfare. The Corvus was essentially a giant boarding bridge, 36 feet long, with a heavy spike at the end. Mounted on a swivel, it could be dropped onto an enemy ship. The spike would pierce the deck, locking the two vessels together. Suddenly, a sea battle became a land battle, exactly the kind of fight Roman legions excelled at. Where Carthaginians relied on ramming and maneuvering, Romans turned naval duels into bloody infantry clashes. Training for the unknown. Still, Rome faced challenges. Thousands of farmers and soldiers had to be retrained as sailors. Men who had spent their lives on fields and roads now learned to row in perfect rhythm, to haul sails, and to endure the sickening sway of the sea. Many failed. Storms wrecked early expeditions, drowning men unused to the ocean. Yet Rome did not give up. Their stubborn resilience would soon pay off. The first test at Mylae. In 260 BC, Rome's new navy met Carthage in open battle near Mylae, on Sicily's northern coast. For the first time, Roman warships rode out in full formation. The Carthaginians laughed at their inexperience, confident they would send this farmer's fleet to the bottom. But when the Carthaginian ships closed in, the Romans unleashed their secret weapon. Corvus after Corvus slammed down, boarding bridges clattering onto enemy decks. Legionaries stormed across, turning sleek naval duels into savage melees of sword and shield. A stunning victory. The result was chaos. Carthage lost dozens of ships. The Romans, once mocked for their lack of naval skill, had scored their first major victory at sea. For the first time in history, Carthage realized Rome was not just a land power. With the Corvus, Rome had changed the rules of naval warfare. The balance shifts. The victory at Mylae was more than symbolic. It gave Rome control of supply routes, boosted morale, and showed their people and their enemies that they could adapt, innovate, and dominate in unfamiliar arenas. But Carthage was not finished. If Rome wanted true mastery of the Mediterranean, even greater trials lay ahead. Clash at Mylae. The Corvus turns the tide, setting the stage. The year was 260 BC. For generations, the Carthaginians had ruled the sea without challenge. Their sailors were professionals, raised on the waves, while Rome's men were farmers turned oarsmen. When Carthage sailed out near the Sicilian town of Mylae, they expected a slaughter. The Carthaginian fleet numbered around 130 warships, sleek and fast, built to ram and outmaneuver. Rome's fleet was of similar size, but awkward and clumsy, its sailors still green. To any observer, the outcome seemed obvious. But the Romans had a secret. The Corvus unleashed. As the Carthaginians swooped in, their ships darting like predators across the sea, the Romans let them come close. Then, with a crash like thunder, the first Corvus boarding bridges slammed down. Spikes bit into wooden decks. The sleek Carthaginian warships, built to dance across the sea, suddenly found themselves shackled in place. Roman legionaries charged across the bridges, shields locked, swords flashing. The naval battle had been transformed into a land battle on the water, exactly what the Romans wanted. Carthaginian shock. The Carthaginian captains were stunned. Their greatest advantage, speed and maneuver, had been stolen from them. Instead of ramming duels, they were now trapped in close combat, where Roman discipline and ferocity reigned supreme. One by one, Carthaginian ships fell. Sailors were cut down, decks ran red with blood, and captured vessels were turned against their own fleet. The turning point. At the height of the clash, Rome's consul Gaius Duilius personally led the charge, rallying his men to victory. His leadership, combined with the terrifying efficiency of the Corvus, shattered Carthaginian morale. When the smoke cleared, Carthage had lost around 50 ships, either captured or sunk. Rome had won its first major naval victory in history. The aftermath. For Carthage, the defeat at Mylae was more than a setback. It was a humiliation. A land-based republic of farmers had beaten the masters of the sea. For Rome, it was a triumph. The victory was so significant that Duilius received a rare honor, a triumph in Rome, where he paraded Carthaginian captives and ships' rams through the streets. A commemorative column, the Columna Rostrata, was erected in his honor, decorated with the prows of captured warships. A new confidence. The message was clear. Rome could no longer be dismissed as a landlocked power. With innovation and determination, they could match and even surpass their enemies. But Mylae was just the beginning. Carthage still held vast resources, experienced admirals, and allies across the Mediterranean. The war would escalate into battles larger than anything the ancient world had seen before. And next, Rome would gamble everything on a colossal confrontation, the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, the largest naval clash of antiquity. Cape Ecnomus, the largest naval battle in antiquity. 1,000 words, cinematic documentary style, Rome's bold gamble. By 256 BC, Rome had grown bold. Victories at Mylae and other skirmishes convinced the Senate that Carthage could not be beaten by fighting only in Sicily. If Rome wanted a decisive end to the war, it would have to strike at Carthage itself, across the sea in North Africa. But to land an army on African soil, Rome first had to protect its transports. That meant assembling a fleet so massive that even Carthage would be forced to take notice. The result was the largest naval force the ancient world had ever seen. Rome built and manned nearly 330 warships, supported by hundreds of transports carrying 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Carthage, unwilling to let such an invasion go unchallenged, mustered a fleet of similar size, around 350 ships. The stage was set for a clash of unimaginable scale. The battle formation off the southern coast of Sicily, near Cape Ecnomus, the two fleets met. The Romans arranged their ships in an unusual formation, a giant wedge designed to protect the vulnerable transports in the center. Carthage, confident in its superior seamanship, spread its fleet wide, planning to envelop and crush the Romans from multiple sides. The sea churned with the movement of nearly 700 warships, more than 500,000 men preparing to fight. The clash of titans. The battle began with Carthage charging at the Roman wedge. Their goal was to draw the Romans forward, break their formation, and then strike at the unprotected transports. For a time, it worked. The Roman vanguard pushed ahead, leaving their rear exposed. Carthaginian squadrons swooped in from the flanks, surrounding parts of the Roman fleet. The sea erupted into chaos, rams splintering hulls, oars snapping, men screaming as they were hurled into the waves. But once again, the Romans unleashed their deadly innovation. Corvus bridges smashed down onto Carthaginian decks, locking ships together. Where Carthage relied on speed, Rome relied on grit. Legionaries stormed ship after ship, cutting down sailors and mercenaries in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Turning, the tide hours of carnage followed. The Carthaginians fought valiantly, but their ships became bogged down in close quarters fighting. Roman discipline, combined with sheer numbers, began to turn the tide. By the end of the day, Carthage had lost around 100 ships, either sunk or captured. Rome lost far fewer. The sea was littered with wreckage and corpses, the waves stained red with blood. A world-shaking victory. Cape Ecnomus was more than just a victory, it was a statement. Rome had defeated Carthage not once, but twice at sea, and now stood poised to carry the war into Africa itself. The triumph electrified Rome. For the first time, the Republic had shown that it could not only defend itself, but also launch bold offensives across the Mediterranean. Yet this boldness would soon come at a cost. The next phase of the war would see Rome's fortunes rise higher than ever, and then crash in disaster. For now, though, the legions prepared to sail south. The war was moving from Sicily to the very heartland of Carthage. Regulus in Africa, triumph and tragedy, the invasion of Africa. After their triumph at Cape Ecnomus, the Romans wasted no time. In 256 BC, their massive fleet escorted an invasion force straight into Carthaginian territory. Never before had Rome struck so boldly beyond Italy. 2 consuls led the expedition, Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso Longus. Landing near Cape Bon, the legions disembarked and began devastating the fertile farmlands of Carthage. Towns were pillaged, crops burned, and thousands taken captive. The war was now on Carthaginian soil. Early Roman success. At first, the invasion went brilliantly. The Carthaginian army, hastily assembled and poorly coordinated, was crushed near Attis. The Romans stormed the enemy camp, driving the defenders into flight. Cities surrendered. Carthage itself trembled. Facing disaster, the Carthaginians sued for peace, but Regulus, arrogant from victory, demanded terms so harsh, including Carthage surrendering its fleet, tribute, and foreign possessions, that the negotiations collapsed. Rome's hubris had set the stage for catastrophe. Enter Xanthippus. In desperation, Carthage turned to an unlikely savior, Xanthippus, a Spartan mercenary commander. Trained in the traditions of Greek warfare, Xanthippus reorganized Carthage's battered forces with ruthless efficiency. He drilled their infantry, cavalry, and especially their war elephants, the most feared beasts of ancient battle. When the two sides met on the plain near the Bagradus River in 255 BC, the contrast was stark. Regulus commanded perhaps 15,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. Xanthippus led a slightly smaller infantry force, but with a massive advantage in cavalry, and nearly 100 war elephants. The Battle of Bagradus. The clash was decisive. Carthaginian elephants thundered forward, smashing into the Roman lines. Legionaries tried to hold formation, stabbing upward with spears. but the sheer weight of the beasts tore holes through their ranks. Carthaginian cavalry swept around the flanks, cutting off Roman retreat. Surrounded, the legions fought with their usual discipline, but they were overwhelmed. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse. Of Regulus's army, nearly all were killed or captured. Only a few thousand managed to escape. Regulus himself was taken prisoner. The dream of conquering Carthage had turned into a nightmare. The legend of Regulus' Roman tradition later wove myths around Regulus's fate. Some stories claimed the Carthaginians sent him back to Rome to negotiate peace, only for him to urge the Senate to continue the war before returning to Carthage, where he was executed under torture. Whether true or exaggerated, Regulus became a symbol of Roman duty, a man who placed the Republic above his own life. A war without end. Though the invasion of Africa had ended in disaster, Rome did not give up. More fleets were built, more legions sent. The war dragged on, shifting back to Sicily, where Carthage and Rome would bleed each other dry in endless sieges and naval clashes. The First Punic War was far from over, and as the struggle entered its next phase, elephants, starvation, storms, and betrayal would define the long, grinding conflict. The long grind in Sicily, elephants, sieges, and setbacks. A war that refused to end. After the disaster of Regulus in Africa, the war dragged back to its original battleground, Sicily. For nearly a decade, neither Rome nor Carthage could deliver a knockout blow. Instead, Sicily became a land of endless sieges, skirmishes, and starvation. The once rich island turned into a wasteland. Crops were burned, towns ruined, and its people enslaved or conscripted. Both powers poured men and money into the struggle, unwilling to retreat. The shadow of the elephant's Carthage leaned heavily on its war elephants, beasts that terrified soldiers unaccustomed to their sight. In battles across Sicily, elephants were unleashed to smash through Roman lines, their tusks sharpened and their backs carrying armored towers. The Romans, however, slowly adapted. They dug trenches, fired volleys of javelins, and learned to lure the beasts into traps where they panicked and trampled their own men. What had once been Carthage's terror weapon became, at times, a liability. Sieges without end. The war was dominated by sieges, cities switching hands, fortresses starved into submission, only to be retaken months later. At places like Lilybaeum and Drepana, Carthaginian strongholds resisted siege after siege. Roman engineers built siege towers and battering rams, but Carthage's fleet kept them supplied. Year after year, both sides bled. Rome lost entire fleets to storms, drowning tens of thousands of men at sea. Carthage endured famine and rebellion in its territories. Still, neither yielded. Naval disaster. One of Rome's greatest setbacks came not from Carthage, but from nature. In 255 BC, after rescuing the survivors of Regulus's African disaster, a Roman fleet of nearly 300 ships was caught in a storm off Sicily's coast. The result was catastrophic. Perhaps 100,000 men drowned, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. Yet in typical Roman fashion, the Republic refused to surrender. Within a few years, they built another fleet from scratch, showing the world their iron will. A stalemate of giants. By the 240s BC, the war had become a stalemate. Carthage held its strongholds but could not expel Rome from Sicily. Rome controlled much of the countryside but could not crack Carthage's coastal fortresses. The island was devastated. Soldiers fought not only the enemy but also hunger and disease. Deserters roamed as bandits. Civilians endured misery on a scale almost unimaginable. The tide begins to turn. Despite the deadlock, time favored Rome. Its manpower reserves were vast, its senate relentless. Carthage, reliant on mercenaries and struggling with revolts in Africa, found it harder and harder to sustain the endless war. The stage was being set for a final confrontation. Rome would once again build a massive fleet and gamble everything on one last battle at sea, the showdown that would end the First Punic War once and for all. The Battle of the Aegates Islands. The war reaches its breaking point. By 242 BC, the First Punic War had dragged on for over 2 decades. Rome and Carthage were exhausted, their treasuries drained, their people weary. Sicily lay in ruins, a graveyard of soldiers and civilians alike. Yet neither side would quit. Carthage clung to its last strongholds in western Sicily, especially Lilybaeum and Drepana. Rome, determined to break the stalemate, resolved to cut off these cities once and for all. To do that, they would need to strike at Carthage's lifeline, the sea. Rome's last fleet. Rome's earlier fleets had been destroyed by storms or lost in battle. But in a final act of determination, the Senate called upon its wealthy citizens to fund a new navy. Aristocrats poured their fortunes into the effort, paying for ships out of their own pockets. The result was a fleet of around 200 quinqueremes, lighter and faster than before, stripped down for speed. These ships carried not only oarsmen, but also hardened legionaries eager to finish the war. Carthage responds. Carthage, too, built a fleet, around 250 ships, but it faced serious disadvantages. Years of war had drained its resources, and many of its sailors were inexperienced mercenaries. Worse still, Carthaginian crews were loaded with supplies for Sicily, making their ships heavier and slower. The stage was set for a decisive clash off the Aegates Islands, west of Sicily, in March 241 BC. The battle unfolds. As dawn broke, the Roman fleet lay in wait, positioned to block Carthage's supply line. When the Carthaginian fleet appeared, burdened with cargo and slowed by the wind, the Romans struck. The lighter Roman ships maneuvered swiftly, ramming and boarding with brutal efficiency. Carthaginian vessels, heavy with supplies, could not outmaneuver them. The sea became a cauldron of shattered hulls, burning timbers, and desperate cries. The Roman crews, drilled to perfection, boarded ship after ship. The discipline of the legions once again proved decisive on water as it had on land. A crushing victory. By the battle's end, Carthage had lost about 120 ships, sunk or captured. Rome lost only a handful. The supply fleet was destroyed, and with it, Carthage's last hope of holding Sicily. The war, after 23 long years, was finally over. Peace, at last. Carthage, broken and bankrupt, sued for peace. Under the treaty, it was forced to evacuate Sicily, pay a massive indemnity, and surrender its hold over the central Mediterranean. Rome, for the first time, stood as the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. What had begun as a local squabble in Messana had ended with Rome as a true empire. The cost of victory. Yet Rome's triumph came at a staggering cost. Hundreds of thousands had died. Entire generations had been lost to war. Sicily was devastated, its wealth drained. Carthage, though defeated, remained proud and seething for revenge. The First Punic War was over, but the hatred between Rome and Carthage was only beginning. The world had not seen the last of this rivalry, for on the horizon was a new generation of Carthaginian commanders, men who would carry Dido's curse back to Rome's very doorstep. Among them was a boy who had sworn eternal hatred against Rome, Hannibal Barca. Aftermath and legacy. Rome and Carthage on the brink of Hannibal, the price of victory. When the First Punic War ended in 241 BC, Rome stood triumphant. For the first time, the Republic ruled lands beyond Italy, with Sicily becoming Rome's first province. But this victory came at a staggering cost. The war had lasted 23 years, the longest and most brutal conflict the ancient world had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost. Entire fleets were swallowed by storms. Sicily, once fertile and prosperous, was left in ruins. Rome had won, but it had nearly bled itself dry. Carthage in defeat. Carthage, too, suffered terribly. forced to abandon Sicily. It also had to pay a crushing indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver, a debt so heavy it strained the city's economy for decades. Worse still, Carthage's reliance on mercenaries came back to haunt it. When the war ended, tens of thousands of unpaid soldiers, Libyans, Gauls, Iberians, demanded their wages. Carthage refused, sparking the infamous Mercenary War, also called the Truceless War, a savage rebellion that nearly tore Carthage apart. The city survived, but its power was weakened. Rome's transformation. For Rome, the war was a turning point. The Republic was no longer just a land power. It had proven it could build fleets, project power overseas, and dominate foreign peoples. Sicily became a testing ground for provincial rule, setting a precedent for Rome's future empire. The Senate had learned a dangerous lesson. Rome could endure staggering losses and still rise stronger. That resilience would become the hallmark of Roman expansion. Seeds of future conflict. Yet peace was fragile. Carthage, though defeated, was not destroyed. Its empire in Spain grew stronger, fueled by silver mines and hardened troops under the command of the brilliant Barca family. One of them, Hamilcar Barca, withdrew from Sicily vowing revenge. His son, Hannibal, was just a child when the war ended. According to legend, Hamilcar made Hannibal swear an oath at the altar that he would never be a friend to Rome. This oath would echo through history, carrying the world toward the Second Punic War, a conflict even more devastating, where Hannibal would march elephants across the Alps and bring Rome to the brink of annihilation. The legacy of the First Punic War. The First Punic War was more than a clash of armies and fleets. It was the moment when the Mediterranean's balance of power shifted forever. Carthage lost its dominance at sea. Rome gained its first overseas territory. Sicily became the first piece of an empire that would one day stretch across 3 continents. The war also showed that Rome's greatest strength was not brilliance, but endurance. Again and again, it suffered disasters, yet it rebuilt, adapted, and fought on until victory. Carthage had been humbled, but not destroyed. The rivalry was not finished. In truth, it had only entered its bloodiest chapter. The curtain falls. For now. As Sicily smoldered in the aftermath, the world might have thought peace had finally come. But beneath the surface, hatred festered. Rome had humiliated Carthage, and Carthage would not forgive. From the ashes of this first great war would rise the most legendary general of antiquity, Hannibal, and with him, a storm that would shake Rome to its foundations. The First Punic War was over. The second was already waiting. The First Punic War was more than a clash between 2 great powers. It was the birth of empire. Rome had stepped beyond Italy, proving its endurance, its resilience, and its hunger for dominance. Carthage, though beaten, was not broken. In its pride, in its hatred, and in the oath of a young Hannibal, the seeds of a far greater conflict had already been sown. This war scarred the Mediterranean. Cities burned, fleets sank, and generations were lost. But from its ashes, a new world was rising. A world that would be forever shaped by the rivalry of Rome and Carthage. And so, as the smoke clears over Sicily and the peace treaty is signed, one truth becomes clear. This was not the end. It was only the beginning.